We'd ask you this evening to turn to 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2. We'll read verse 16 here to get our thoughts tonight. It says, "For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world." We want to speak tonight on the sin of pride. Now, pride is used many times in our present day that doesn't match, that doesn't really mean what pride does here. Pride here, the definition of this pride here is the practice of arrogant display of boasting. And this is what pride is talking about here. The practice of arrogant display of boasting. And we've all probably know people who fit that category for many reasons, many ways. I've been around people who were not so much in recent years, but younger years, who were gifted athletes, and they were very arrogant, very prideful of that. I've seen parents when Aaron was in school that were very arrogant and prideful of their sons as far as their athletic abilities. Seen people who were successful as far as the world, occupation in this world, that are very arrogant and prideful of those things. I've seen people who are very intelligent and want everybody to know about it, and are very arrogant and prideful about it. And this is what we want to see what the sin of pride is. It's a very arrogant type person that John is talking about here. And as we look again at this verse, he says, "For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world." So as we look at the sin of pride, we recognize it's not of God, it's of the world. And the world we live in encourages pride. Many ways, we've been inbred with it in our minds to be proud Americans, and we ought to be thankful. But having traveled some in other parts of this world, some would have you to believe that Americans are the most prideful, arrogant individuals when it comes to national pride that exists, and this is not so. This is not true. I've been in several European countries, Germany, stationed there for 2.5 years. They're very prideful people in their existence. We was in Turkey, and Muslims countries, they're very arrogant and prideful of their existence. So it's not unique to America. But we're not concerned, we don't want to be concerned about that today. We want to understand what pride is from the Scriptures. And at all cost, on our own, avoid being prideful in this sense. We want to see, as we turn to the 10th Psalm, that the Lord tells us here that the wicked are proud and persecute the poor. In Psalms chapter 10, in verse 2, the Bible tells us here, it says, "The wicked in his pride doth persecute the poor. Let them be taken in the devices that they have imagined." Now, in our world, even probably in our own community sometimes, there are those who are not necessarily well off, but you could say better off than others, and they're prideful of that, and they persecute those who have less. And it's evident sometimes in kids, but where do they learn that? Where do they learn to be arrogantly proud and persecute those who have less? They learn it at home. They learn it from their parents. We had many times in the academy students that their home life, they had virtually nothing. And there was many times myself, Mr. Shaw, Joan Dickinson, and other staff members would pay for lunch for some of those kids because the cafeteria would refuse to give them any credit. And we would go ahead and buy them lunch. But there was others in that same way that were more well off would be very prideful and look down their noses at some of these kids because they didn't have everything they had. They didn't have clothes like they had. They didn't have shoes like they had. And this is wrong. This is sin. We note here that God refers to the prideful soul as those who are wicked. The wicked in his pride doth persecute the poor. Let them be taken in the devices that they have imagined. I seen one case in my lifetime when I was growing up where the people had been well off, and the parents and the children were all very prideful in this and looked down their noses, so to speak, at those who had less, and their whole world came crashing down on them. Dad lost his job. They ended up losing their home. And they were ones that ended up being poor. They left our area and never knew what happened to them. But this is what the Lord's talking about. The wicked in his pride doth persecute the poor. Let them be taken in the devices that they have imagined. Now, the prideful person will in time sink into the mire of their own doing. Looking back here in chapter 9, Psalms 9, and verse 15, he says here, "The heathen are sunk down in the pit that they made. In the net which they hid is their own foot taken." And this was the case, you might say, with these individuals who were very prideful of their success, very prideful of their possessions, very prideful of their position, and looking down at others, but they were caught in their own pit, and they sank in their own pit. This pride is sin. And we find another example of this with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. The children of Israel had been slaves for many years. They weren't slaves when they first came into Egypt, but as the Bible tells us that after years after Joseph died, and the Pharaoh didn't know Joseph, that he made Israel, the Israelites, his slaves. And in the process of time, God sent Moses to deliver them from the bondage of Egypt. As we look back in Exodus chapter 5, we find here when Moses first went to Pharaoh and asked, as God had instructed him, to Pharaoh to let his people go. And we find Pharaoh's response in Exodus 5 in verse 2. It says, "And Pharaoh said, Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go." So what was his response? Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? Now when we think about Pharaoh and his pride here, okay, he was the king of Egypt at this time. Egypt was the wealthiest nation on earth at that time. They had all that you can imagine, gold and silver and precious things, and they had these millions of Jews who were their slaves to do their labor. They had free labor, and they were proud of this. And they had their gods that they worshiped. And when Moses came to him, as God had instructed him and Aaron, and God said, "Let my people go." Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? Can you not see the sarcasm in that? The arrogance in his response? This is a prideful, arrogant response. Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? Well, we know Pharaoh's ignorance of God and arrogant pride. He did not want to let Israel go. But what was the end result for Pharaoh and his arrogancy? He and his army perished in the Red Sea. The proud are changed. The proud are changed to their pride, or chained. They're chained to their pride. In other words, they're locked into that. They're bound by that pride. In Psalms again, in Psalm 73. This means in themselves, they can't change. Just like Pharaoh here, in himself, he could not change. He didn't fear God. He didn't recognize God. Here in Psalm 73 and verse 6 says, "Therefore pride compasseth them about as a chain. Violence covereth them as a garment." Pride to them is like a chain. And this chain here is indicating, that they're locked into it. They're bound in their pride. They don't, it's bound to them in a way that they don't want to change. Pride is a terrible sin. As chained of godly curse is upon them that are proud. In Psalms 119 here, Psalms 119 and verse 21 says, "Thou hast rebuked the proud that are cursed, which do err from thy commandments. Thou hast rebuked the proud that are a curse. God has rebuked them, but they're chained to this arrogancy. They're chained to this pride, and they cannot see anything. You say they're blinded by this pride, because in their pride they think they're better than anyone else, or they're above someone else. Back in chapter 109 here of the Psalms, we see pride of a soul covers him like a suit of clothing. In verse 18 here of chapter 9, says, as he clothed himself with cursing, like as with his garment, so let it come into his bowels like water, and like oil unto his bones. He's clothed himself. It's like his garments here. He's encased in pride. It's his wardrobe, so to speak. This is the sin. Such a covering of pride makes a person miserable. Have you not seen people that are very arrogant in their pride, and really they're some of the most miserable people that you'll ever be around? They are arrogant, they are prideful, but they're miserable. There's no joy in them. They're never satisfied. And many of them, the more they get, the more they want. And that's a part of pride. Pride is one of the things that God hates. It's one of those things that God says is an abomination unto him. We see that in the 6th chapter of the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 6, and there are the whole list of things here that God says are an abomination and that he hates. 7 things. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16 says, these 6 things are the Lord hate. Yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. Look what's number 1, a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, and heart that deviseth wicked imaginations, feet that be swift in running to mischief, a false witness that speaketh lies, and he that soweth discord among brethren. And number 1, pride. Pride. A proud look. And when you look at the definition of proud as being an arrogant individual, and you look at all these things that follow pride here, are they not all part of being an arrogant individual? But pride is one of these things. It says one of the things that God hates. It's an abomination unto God. Therefore, we ought at all cost within ourselves avoid such behavior. Pride in time will bring shame upon the individual. In the 11th proverb here, Proverbs 11 and verse 2, it says, when pride cometh, then cometh shame, but with the lowly is wisdom. Pride will bring shame. Shame. And you think back, I think back to that family that lost everything. They went from being very high and mighty and proud to nothing. You reckon there might have been some shame in there with them? It may be why they disappeared from the neighborhood, because they couldn't face those whom they had looked down upon. Those things God hates will in time destroy those that practice such things. Pride will also cause a soul to fall. Here in Proverbs, again in chapter 16, Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 18, he says, "Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." Pride goeth before a fall. Many times, a prideful, arrogant individual will eventually fall in their own in their own evil. They will be brought down. I've seen many in athletics who have thought themselves better than anybody else at whatever the sport may be. And when they fail, when someone else comes along that is better and they're defeated, they fall, and they fall hard. And sometimes they just can't take it. But pride cometh before a fall. God is the only one who brings the events in the life of the proud individual that will bring them down. In chapter 18 here of Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 27, we see here Proverbs 18 it's Psalms, not Proverbs. Psalms 18 and verse 27. Psalms 18 and verse 27, the scripture tells us here, "For thou wilt save the afflicted people, but wilt bring down high looks." He will save. In other words, God, what he's saying here, God protects. He protects those that are afflicted. Remember what we read from Psalms 10 and verse 2, that the proud persecute the poor. So what he's saying here, in that case, God's going to bring them down. They're going to suffer because of their pride, because of their prideful looks in actions, in attitudes. God will bring them down. When the proud are humbled, they will have red faces. Many times they'll have a red face. They'll be embarrassed when they're brought down. And we see an example of pride back in the book of 2 Kings with Naaman. Naaman was the king of Syria, and he had leprosy. And he had in his home, there was a young Israelite girl who was serving as his maid, and he made a request. Is there anybody that knows, anybody that can help cure me of this dreadful disease? And this young lady said, there's a prophet in Israel, Elisha, that can help you. Now, the Syrians, they were very prideful when it come to their relationship with the Israelites. They felt themselves to be better than the Israelites. And But he relented and had Elisha, sent for Elisha. And they despised not just Israel, but their land. And here was his response in 2 Kings 5 and verse 11. When Elisha told him to go to the Jordan River and wash himself 7 times, and he would come out clean. Verse 11 says, Now Naaman was wroth, and went away, and said, Behold, I thought he will surely come out to me, and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and strike his hand over the place, and recover the leper. He thought, here's the prophet of God. He's going to come, and he's going to call on the name of his Lord God, and he's going to heal me of this leprosy. And he said, Is there not cleaner rivers in Syria? That Jordan is just a dirty, muddy old river. But he did relent, and he did go down, and he did wash, as we see here. First, let's go back to verse 7. It says, And it came to pass, when the king of Israel had read the letter, that he rent his clothes and said, Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man does send unto me to recover a man from his leprosy? Wherefore consider, I pray you, and see how he speaketh a quarrel against me. And it was so, when Elisha the man of God had heard that the king of Israel had rent his clothes, that he sent the king, saying, Wherefore hast thou rent thy clothes? Let him come now to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. And Naaman came with his horses and with his chariots, and stood at the door of the house of Elisha. And Elisha sent a messenger unto him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come again to thee, and thou shalt be clean. And Naaman was wroth, and went away, and said, Behold, I thought I will surely come out to me, and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and strike his hand over the place, and recover the leper. But, look in verse 14. Then went he down, and dipped himself 7 times in Jordan, to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh came again like unto him the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. He relented. But pride had got in his way initially. He didn't want to go to Elisha to start with. He's a Jew. But then he says, well, if he's the prophet of the Lord his God, then all he's got to do is what? Wave his arms, and this leprosy will leave. No, that wasn't the instructions that God had sent. Go wash 7 times in the Jordan, and you will come forth clean. We think also of the parable the Lord gave concerning the Good Samaritan. There was a Jew who was walking along and met with thieves and was beaten, robbed, and left to die. And a priest come by and looked at him and went over on the other side of the road. A Levite did the same thing. But here was this Samaritan who was despised of the Jews. I mean, the Jews were very arrogant against the Samaritans. But this Samaritan, he bound the man's wounds, took him to an inn, and left him there, and told the innkeeper, do whatever you need to do for him, and left some money. And he said, if it's cost you any more than what I've left you, the next time I pass by here, I'll pay it. There was no pride with the Samaritan. And he let the pride of the Jews stand aside to help another human being. Pride will in time bring shame upon them. We've seen this in Proverbs 11 and verse 2, but let's look at that again. Proverbs 11 and verse 2. Keep going back. Proverbs 11 and verse 2 there says, when pride cometh, then cometh shame, but with the lowly is wisdom. With pride cometh shame. In other words, in time, maybe not initially, but in time, pride will cost the individual who is arrogant in that pride, and it will cost him shame. Shame and defeat. Shame and loss. Shame before those who may be even higher than them, whether it become wealth or abilities. The shame many times will be in the form of contention between those involved. In chapter 13 here of Proverbs 13 and verse 10, he says, only by pride cometh contention, but with the well-advised is wisdom. Have you ever seen, and again thinking back to children and athletics and parents, have you ever seen two parents knock heads, so to speak, over the pride of their children and their abilities? I've seen them argue over whose child was the best, who was superior. And some competition one time between students, and there was someone whom they didn't even consider as in the competition, that won the competition, won the trophy. And you talk about two parents that were shameful. Here they had almost knocked down, drag out, fought over whose child was the best in somebody else's. Some unknown wins the trophy. Pride, shamefulness. Pride many times causes a person not to want to admit their fault. We've seen that many times. And being shamed at the truth. Pride, bringing them to the point that they don't want to admit that they're wrong. And yet, when proven wrong, they are shameful. And one individual who was very prideful in his position, again as a king, was Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. God had used him, given him the power and the ability and the army to defeat Israel or Judah and take the Jews captive into Babylon. And he was very prideful and very arrogant in his position. So look in Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4. And we see what happens to Nebuchadnezzar. Now God brought him down. But as we look in chapter 4, first of all, we see here in verses 28 through 30, says, and this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty. In other words, look what I have done. Here I'm the king of Babylon. Look at this house that I built, that I've done. Look at this, he could say, look at this kingdom that I command. Look at this kingdom that I am over. But we find God brought him down. Verse 31, it says, while the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee, and they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth the kingdom of men, and giveth to it to whomsoever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was delivered or driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. For 7 years. For 7 years. This was Nebuchadnezzar's fate. From prideful king, looking at what he had done, to living like an animal, where his hair became like feathers, and his claws became like eagles, and he ate grass with the oxen in the field for 7 years, and he was out of his mind for 7 years. But when God brought him back, when his pride, when God had caused him to suffer in his pride, and it was over, let's see what he says in verses 34 and 35. This is, at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? What a change. From a prideful king who thought himself the greatest upon the earth, who had built this great kingdom and this great house, to a humble individual who knew who God was. You see, the opposite then of being a prideful individual is one who is humble before Almighty God. So we look back to our text verse then in 1 John in chapter 2 and verse 16. 1 John in chapter 2 and verse 16, again he says, for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. Pride is an attribute of this world. It's an attribute of this world. It's not of God. It's not of God. God is not prideful. We are commanded not to be prideful. Pride is an attribute of this world. In fact, where did pride come from? Pride came from Satan. As a beautiful angel in his creation. What did he do? He's seen his beauty that God had created him with. He's seen the wisdom that God had created him with. And he said within himself, I'm going to put myself above God. Pride brought this into his heart. And pride brought him down, and he was fallen and kicked out of heaven. And 1/3 of the angels went with him. But we think of pride amongst men. We find the first case amongst men was with Cain. When Eve gave birth to Cain and then Abel. Again, they were raised by the same parents, taught the same thing. And at that time, they were to bring their sacrifice before the entrance to the Garden of Eden. They couldn't go into the Garden of Eden, but that's where they were to bring their sacrifices. And they were to bring a blood sacrifice. And Cain said, I'm tiller of the soil. I've grown vegetables, and that's what I'm going to take, and God's going to have to take it. Prideful in what he had done. Abel, on the other hand, was a keeper of sheep. And he brought of the firstlings of his flock, and the fat thereof, and offered it before God. Now what could Cain have done? He could have gone with the first fruits and purchased a sheep to make a sacrifice. But he said, God, in his pride, he said, God's going to have to accept what I bring. And as a result, when God accepted Abel's and rejected Cain's, what did he do in his pride? Well, he went for a walk with his brother. And he slew his brother because of the pride that was within his heart. Pride is of this world. Pride is a sin of this world. Many times when eyes look upon any success, they have pride within themselves. And again, pride is of this world. We find another example of pride in the book of Esther. There's a man named Haman here in the book of Esther. He hated Jews. And there were still at this time many Jews scattered about the world. And here in Persia, there was a man named Mordecai. He had raised his cousin, who became Queen Esther. But Mordecai was outside the gate to the palace. And Haman had been given a high position. And he demanded that everybody bow down to him. He wasn't the king. But he demanded everybody bow down to him. And Mordecai refused. And here in chapter 3 and verse 5, we find here that when Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman, says, and when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, was Haman full of wrath. And as time progressed here, Haman devised within his mind he was going to get rid of Mordecai. He was going to hang Mordecai from a gallows. And he wanted to get a commandment from the king, Ahasuerus, to post throughout the kingdom to execute all the Jews. And it backfired on him. As Mordecai had gone in, seen Esther, to tell the king what Mordecai had planned. And as it turned out, Mordecai had done the king a great favor. And when the king inquired, is there anybody that has done me a great deed and that I have not rewarded? And it said, Mordecai. And he gave Mordecai a high position. And Haman was even more angered. Pride entered in even more. Well, he was a Persian. Mordecai was a Jew. And of course, we know Esther had brought about like he had tried to force her. And the king ordered Haman to be hung on his own gallows, and also his 10 sons. So his pride brought him down, brought death upon him and upon his 10 sons, because his pride despised Mordecai the Jew, despised that Mordecai had found favor in the eyes of the king. Pride is a very wicked sin. It's of the world. As we stand at this time and have a verse of song, we'd ask tonight if the Lord has spoken to you in any way. If there's anything you need to bring before us, feel free to do so at this time.